At 3:14 a.m., the cabin suddenly became the scene of chaos when a loud snap broke the quiet night. A man in a polo shirt whispered, "You broke the gate, Daryl? That was the wrong lock." The Prairie Hollow Homeowners Association patrol, dressed in bright polo shirts, were sneaking through the wet grass of Willow Creek Cabin. They carried flashlights and clipboards with the serious attitude of school hall monitors. They weren't carrying weapons, just HOA rule books and color charts for fences. They came to deliver 3 violation notices and make their community better. What they didn't know was that inside the cabin barn, Sheriff Bud Kilpatrick was sleeping. Recently retired, recently separated from his wife, and now suddenly woken up by HOA members breaking his gate. He was snoring loudly and holding his loaded shotgun. Bud woke to footsteps and flashlight beams coming through the cracks in the barn wall. The smell of hay filled his nose, with a half-burned cigar still in his mouth. He grabbed his shotgun before even putting on his boots. 40 years as a lawman taught him to act first, ask questions later. He cracked open the barn door just in time to see a man in khaki pants kneeling down to measure the height of his mailbox with a bright tape measure. But didn't ask who they were, he just cocked his gun, making a loud, clear sound. The HOA group froze, all heads turning toward the barn. The one with the clipboard dropped it, papers flying everywhere. A short guy with perfect hair and a hawk tattoo on his ankle tried to run but tripped over a garden hose. Bud stepped out into the night like someone from an old Western movie. Shirtless, unshaven, wild-eyed, and completely furious. "You got 10 seconds to explain why you're measuring my damn mailbox before I start counting violations of my own." The HOA patrol stared at him like he was a ghost or an angry bear. Daryl, their leader, tried to speak but could only wheeze something about Rule 7C, unauthorized architectural modifications. Bud took 2 steps forward and pointed his gun. "You broke a gate, trespassed after midnight, and I'm pretty sure you scared my goat. That's a lot of charges, boys." By sunrise, 3 of the 4 HOA patrol members were zip-tied to patio chairs, drinking coffee they didn't want, served by Bud's mother, Grandma Pat. She believed it was her duty to feed anyone on their property, criminal or not. The 4th HOA member, Daryl, had called his mom during the incident. That was a mistake. His mom was Linda Voss, the HOA president, a woman with the face of a prosecutor and a heart of steel. Josie Kilpatrick, Bud's daughter, pulled into the cabin driveway just as Linda's Mercedes arrived. Both women stepped out looking ready for a fight. Josie was in her 30s, strong-jawed, tired-eyed, and dressed like someone who could fix a tractor and argue legal matters in the same hour. Linda wore high heels, pearls, and a look that screamed, "You'll hear from my lawyer." "Ma'am, I'd love to know why your HOA cult broke onto my family's property at 3 o'clock in the morning," Josie said first. Linda didn't flinch. "Your fence is fire engine red. That is not an approved color, and your chicken coop is too close to the main road. My team was enforcing regulations. They broke and entered. They were fulfilling civic duty. They peed on," that part was true. One of the HOA members, afraid of Bud's shotgun and possibly for his life, had an accident on the decorative garden gnome. That gnome had been painted by Josie and her younger brother Riley when they were 10. Everyone was upset about it. Bud walked up behind them mid-argument. He had a shirt on now, but it was unbuttoned. His cigar was lit again. "Linda," he said through clenched teeth, "you step 1 more foot on my land, I'll cite you for attempted invasion under Section 11 of the Texas Land and Livestock Act." "There is no Section 11, Linda hissed. "There is when I write it." Inside the house, Riley, 28 and recently into survivalist preparation, watched everything through binoculars from the upstairs window. He ran a small but weird podcast about neighborhood corruption. And this, he knew, was his golden opportunity. The situation grew quickly. News spread fast in Prairie Hollow, mostly because Grandma Pat called her bridge club, which was also the local gossip network. By lunch, people were arriving in pickup trucks with lawn chairs, camping out just to watch the drama unfold. One guy sold t-shirts reading "Free the Mailbox," while someone else printed flyers declaring the Kilpatrick cabin a sovereign zone. A local blogger wrote that Bud had held 4 civilians hostage and declared martial law with a side of omelets. Josie, trying to maintain order, called the town sheriff's office. She forgot for a moment that her father was the former sheriff and most of his deputies were either fishing, retired, or owed him favors. No one was going to handle this case without proper paperwork. By sunset, Linda had filed a cease and desist order. Bud filed a counterclaim stating that the HOA had violated the Homestead Exemption Clause of 1994. That clause hadn't been used in 20 years and was mostly legend, but Bud had a copy of it laminated and mounted in the barn. He'd been waiting for this kind of fight for decades. As night fell, Josie sat on the porch with a beer, watching the horizon where HOA patrol cars parked just beyond the property line. Their headlights looked like watching eyes. Bud stood beside her, arms crossed. "They'll come back," she said. "Good," he said. "I sleep better when I know the enemy's nervous." She looked at him. "You slept in the barn next to a goat with sleep problems. And I still slept better than when I was married." They both laughed, though the tension remained. Somewhere in the dark, a drone buzzed. Surveillance. The HOA wasn't done. Not even close. And neither was the Kilpatrick cabin. The morning after the incident, Prairie Hollow was buzzing like someone had kicked a hornet's nest. The local Facebook group, usually for lost cats and passive-aggressive comments about recycling bins, was now a battleground of accusations, memes and grainy videos of Sheriff Bud zip-tying HOA volunteers to patio furniture. Linda Voss had gone on full attack. Within hours she'd arranged a press conference in front of her perfect lawn, surrounded by banners that read "Law and Order starts with rules." She stood beside a lawyer in a cheap gray suit who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Her voice rang out with righteous anger as she declared the Kilpatrick cabin a zone of anarchy, accusing Bud of taking the law into his own hands and Josie of keeping illegal livestock structures. She described the barn as a militia compound and the rooster as a weaponized alarm system. Back at the cabin, Bud was fixing the gate with a hammer, shirtless again, while Grandma Pat brought him lemonade and muttered about Linda's Botox. Josie sat at the kitchen table staring down at a pile of official-looking HOA citations, violations for improper fence aesthetics, an unauthorized flagpole, which was actually a clothesline, and a notice about aggressive poultry. Riley paced behind her, earbuds in, broadcasting live to his loyal podcast audience of 6, possibly 7, people. "They've escalated," he said. "Classic authoritarian move. When the people push back, the machine starts finding new violations." Josie slapped the citation down. "They find the wind chimes." "Wind chimes? What's next?" "Grandma's hair," Riley said solemnly. "She's over the decibel limit when she sneezes near a window." Bud wandered in, wiping his hands on a rag. "I got an idea." The last time Bud had an idea, a birthday party ended with 3 fire trucks and a restraining order from the clown union. Still the family leaned in. He placed a dusty metal box on the table. "Found this in the shed. Belonged to your granddaddy." Inside was a mess of old papers, yellow documents, and a tin of loose bullets. Josie sifted through them, her fingers pausing on a thick envelope marked "Deed, Willow Creek Cabin." There were maps, signatures, and a handwritten clause that made her sit up straighter. "Wait, this clause says the HOA can't enforce regulations on any cabin with 12 or more livestock and an official law officer living on site." Riley's eyes lit up. "You're kidding?" "No. Grandpa must have added it before they formed the HOA. It was grandfathered in. Nobody caught it." Bud crossed his arms, a satisfied smirk twitching beneath his mustache. "I'm still a law officer. Technically retired, not resigned. Badge is in the barn." Josie reread the clause. "We've got 11 chickens and a goat. We need one more animal." Riley dashed out of the room before anyone could stop him. 15 minutes later, he returned with a borrowed duck from the Henderson farm and placed it in the backyard like he was defusing a bomb. "There," he said. "Duck acquired. Welcome to freedom, little guy." Josie filed the papers, scanned the clause, and sent a certified letter to the HOA declaring exemption status under Clause 47B of the original property deed. Linda received it that afternoon and, for the first time in recorded history, was seen blinking rapidly and speechless. But silence was never Linda's style for long. The next morning the cabin woke up to a new wave of attack. The HOA began issuing daily citations to all residents who interacted with the Kilpatrick family. Nancy from next door was fined for letting her dogs sniff too close to the cabin fence. Kyle, the feed store guy, received a warning for encouraging non-compliant commerce because he delivered hay. The HOA was using paperwork like a weapon with the precision of a military drone. Riley, fueled by anger and discount energy drinks, converted his podcast into a full-blown resistance movement. He printed flyers reading "Don't let the HOA take your hay," and stapled them to telephone poles. He started live streaming Operation Freedom Farms, featuring guests including conspiracy theorists, musicians, and at one point, a ventriloquist whose puppet passionately argued about property rights. People laughed at first, but then they listened. Locals began bringing animals to the cabin. Ducks, goats. A woman named Trish showed up with a ferret named Kevin. A guy from 2 towns over arrived with a llama that had one eye and a bad attitude. By the end of the week, the Kilpatricks had what could only be described as a defensive livestock perimeter. Meanwhile, inside her fortress of HOA documents and drama, Linda was losing control. Her son Daryl, yes, the same Daryl who wet himself in fear of Bud's shotgun, had started spending more and more time at the cabin. Unknown to Linda, he had fallen hard for Josie. She didn't exactly return the feeling, but she tolerated him, which for Daryl felt like a passionate affair. One night over awkward tea and conversation about manure, he let something slip. They're planning a full compliance sweep at midnight on Saturday. Like full force, private security and all. Josie narrowed her eyes. Why would the HOA need private security for a property dispute? Daryl looked down. They think your dad's dangerous. Riley, listening from the next room, burst in. Finally. We're officially the rebels. They're bringing in the Empire. Bud, when informed, didn't say much. He just loaded the shotgun and checked the barn lights. That Saturday night, the cabin prepared like it was facing invasion. Grandma Pat made cocoa and set up camp chairs. Locals arrived with snacks. Riley handed out walkie-talkies with code names like Chicken One and Alpaca Doom. Josie reviewed the deed and legal documents, while Bud walked the perimeter in silence, nodding at the goats as if they were soldiers under his command. At 11:59 p.m., 2 black SUVs rolled up to the cabin gate. Men in matching tactical gear emerged, holding clipboards and tasers. One spoke into a radio. A drone hovered into position. Somewhere, dramatic music played from a car speaker. Then the goats screamed and chaos descended. Bud stepped into the headlights, holding the deed in one hand and the shotgun in the other. You're trespassing on private property, protected by livestock and law. The lead security officer said something about code enforcement. Bud fired one shot into the air. The animals responded like a symphony of farmyard fury. The duck charged first. The llama spat on a man's boots. Kevin the ferret ran up someone's pant leg. Flashlights whipped in every direction. Someone got hit with a pie, courtesy of Grandma Pat, who had baked it just for the occasion. Riley streamed the whole thing live. Over 4,000 viewers tuned in before the feed cut out. By the time dawn broke, the SUVs were gone. The security team had retreated, covered in feathers and shame. Josie stood in the driveway with Bud and Riley, watching the sun rise over a land full of quacking victory. They'll be back, Bud said again. But this time, Josie replied, we're ready. From the barn, a chicken crowed proudly. And somewhere in the distance, Linda Voss was screaming into a pillow. 3 days after the Great Duck-led revolt, the town of Prairie Hollow found itself gripped by a peculiar kind of tension. It wasn't the kind that came from real danger or global crisis, but the kind that made people leave their porches just to peek around corners and whisper in grocery store aisles. Every conversation started with, "Did you see what happened at the Kilpatrick cabin?" and ended with, "Linda won't let that go." Sure enough, Linda Voss wasn't done. No, she had gone quiet. And that was the worst sign of all. Bud knew it. Josie felt it. Even the animals seemed more alert. The ducks were sticking closer together. The goat had taken to sleeping near the door. Grandma Pat was baking more than usual, which was her stress response, and she had just pulled out a third cherry cobbler before lunch. Riley had begun building what he called a decentralized surveillance grid, which was really just a bunch of baby monitors duct taped to fence posts. But it didn't matter. Something was coming and they all knew it. That something arrived on Thursday afternoon, disguised as a town hall meeting. Linda called it under the pretense of rebuilding community trust. It was held in the Prairie Hollow Rec Center, and nearly everyone showed up, lured by the promise of free coffee and passive-aggressive speeches. Linda stood at the front of the room, a vision of tailored rage, holding a microphone and a binder so thick it could stop a bullet. She began by listing infractions. Then came her proposal. Effective immediately, she was hiring a third-party enforcement team, the Compliance Enforcers. Not police, not government, just a private firm licensed to conduct visual inspections, issue citations and enforce HOA mandates under emergency charter regulations. They've been deputized by a loophole, she dug up in a document no one remembered signing in 2003. They were coming to the cabin. She made that perfectly clear. Riley whispered, "That's it. She's gone full regime." Bud cracked his knuckles. Josie just looked tired. The next morning the enforcers arrived. 2 vans pulled up with tinted windows and a logo that looked like it belonged to a parking lot security company from a dystopian movie. Out stepped 7 men in matching dark blue polos with tactical belts and smug expressions. One of them carried a body camera. Another wore mirrored sunglasses indoors. They immediately began issuing citations for a misplaced wheelbarrow, for a scarecrow they deemed intimidating, for the rooster's early morning vocal range. The goat was written up for loitering. Josie stared in disbelief as one officer crouched down to photograph a broken garden hose. Bud didn't say anything that morning. He just watched from the porch, sipping coffee and waiting. When a lead enforcer approached him with a violation notice for an improperly stored firearm, even though it was clearly locked up and mounted above the mantel, Bud took the slip, read it slowly and folded it into a paper airplane. Then he launched it straight into the man's face. That night, the cabin had its first strategy meeting. Josie, Bud, Riley, Grandma Pat, Daryl, and a few loyal neighbors gathered around the kitchen table. The mood was grim but determined. Riley suggested a perimeter alarm system made from empty soup cans and cowbells. Josie recommended legal escalation. Grandma Pat just poured whiskey into everyone's lemonade and called it situation juice. Bud leaned back in his chair. They want a show. Let's give them one. The following morning, the Kilpatrick cabin transformed. Riley live-streamed it all. Locals arrived with their weirdest animals: a three-legged donkey, a parrot that cursed in Spanish, and a miniature horse named Dennis who wore shoes. Bud stood on a hay bale and made a speech about the spirit of the land, private property rights, and the sacred honor of not being fined for rooster-related activities. Josie set up a table with flyers explaining the deed clause, while Grandma Pat sold pies to fund potential court costs. When the compliance enforcers returned, they found more than just a few chickens and a cranky sheriff. They found a coordinated, enthusiastic resistance, armed with knowledge, sarcasm, and an unshakable love for their land. The enforcers began to push forward. That's when Bud gave the signal. Eggs flew first, then pies. Riley released the ducks. Kevin the ferret made another surprise appearance, leaping from under a picnic table straight onto an enforcer's leg. The donkey brayed like a war horn. One of the enforcers tried to call for backup, but his radio was drowned out by the sound of Grandma Pat playing a kazoo version of the Star-Spangled Banner. It wasn't just chaos, it was spectacle. Bud, riding the tractor like a general leading his troops, approached the lead enforcer and handed him a folder. Inside were notarized copies of the deed, the exemption clause, photographic evidence of the enforcer's trespassing, and a cease and desist signed by a retired judge who also happened to owe Bud a favor after a long fishing trip in 1997. The lead enforcer looked at it, looked at the egg on his chest and made a call. They left 30 minutes later, defeated and dripping with meringue. But the final blow came from Daryl, not the ferret but the human. He had quietly collected records from his mother's office during his visits home, and that morning he handed them to Josie. Inside were financial statements, receipts and hidden emails showing that Linda had funneled HOA funds into personal projects, including a home sauna and an all-expenses-paid HOA retreat to Arizona that she labeled as compliance training. Josie didn't need to do anything dramatic. She simply forwarded the documents to the county ethics board, posted a few screenshots online, and let the internet do what it does best. By the next morning, Linda's front lawn was filled with reporters, HOA board members demanding her resignation, and one man dressed as a chicken holding a sign that read "Poultry Justice." Within days, Linda stepped down. The HOA was dissolved pending investigation. All citations were voided. Prairie Hollow's residents gathered at the Kilpatrick cabin for a spontaneous celebration. There were fireworks. Someone brought a bounce house. Bud gave a toast with lemonade spiked with just enough bourbon to bring a tear to even the goat's eyes. Josie announced her decision to run for county commissioner. Riley was offered a deal to turn his podcast into a web series. Grandma Pat was elected honorary mayor of the property. As for Bud, he finally moved out of the barn and back into the house. He put his shotgun back on its mount, his badge in a frame, and declared himself officially re-retired. He slept in a real bed that night, uninterrupted by goats or HOA agents. Just peace and the soft sound of Dennis the miniature horse snoring in the yard. On the edge of the property, a new sign was posted. It read, "Private property homestead exempt. HOA free since April 2025. Trespassers will be fed pie." The war was over, but the story would be told for years. And if anyone ever dared to bring back an HOA to Prairie Hollow, they'd have to go through the ducks first.